Part 2, sections 6 through 22 of A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, by Edmund Burke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, by Edmund Burke. Section 6, Privation. All general privations are great, because they are all terrible. Vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence. With what a fire of imagination, yet with what severity of judgment, has Virgil amassed all these circumstances, where he knows that all the images of a tremendous dignity ought to be united at the mouth of hell; where, before he unlocks the secrets of the great deep, he seems to be seized with a religious horror, and to retire astonished at the boldness of his own design. Dii quibus imperium est animarum umerque silentis, et chaos et phlegathon, loca nocte silentia late. Sit mihi fas audita loqui, sit numine vestro. Pondere res alta terra et caligne mersas, ibant obscure sola sub nocte per umbram, perque domos ditis vacuos et inania regus. Ye subterraneous gods, whose awful sway the gliding ghosts and silent shades obey, O chaos hoar, and phlegathon profound, whose solemn empire stretches wide around, give me ye great tremendous powers to tell of scenes and wonders in the depth of hell. Give me your mighty secrets to display, from those black realms of darkness to the day. Pit. Obscure they went through dreary shades that led along the waste dominions of the dead. Dryden. Section 7, Vastness. Greatness, footnote, Part 4, Section 9, end footnote, of dimension is a powerful cause of the sublime. This is too evident, and the observation too common, to need any illustration. It is not so common to consider in what ways greatness of dimension, vastness of extent or quantity, has the most striking effect. For certainly there are ways and modes wherein the same quantity of extension shall produce greater effects than it is found to do in others. Extension is either in length, height, or depth. Of these, the length strikes least. 100 yards of even ground will never work such an effect as a tower 100 yards high, or a rock or mountain of that altitude. I am apt to imagine likewise that height is less grand than depth, and that we are more struck at looking down from a precipice than looking up at an object of equal height. But of that I am not very positive. A perpendicular has more force in forming the sublime than an inclined plane, and the effects of a rugged and broken surface seem stronger than where it is smooth and polished. It would carry us out of our way to enter in this place into the cause of these appearances, but certain it is they afford a large and fruitful field of speculation. However, it may not be amiss to add to these remarks upon magnitude, that as the great extreme of dimension is sublime, so the last extreme of littleness is in some measure sublime likewise. When we attend to the infinite divisibility of matter, when we pursue animal life into these excessively small and yet organized beings, that escape the nicest inquisition of the sense, when we push our discoveries yet downward, and consider those creatures so many degrees yet smaller, and the still diminishing scale of existence, in tracing which the imagination is lost as well as the sense, we become amazed and confounded at the wonders of minuteness. nor can we distinguish in its effect this extreme of littleness from the vast itself. For division must be infinite as well as addition, because the idea of a perfect unity can no more be arrived at than that of a complete whole, to which nothing may be added. Section 8. Infinity. Another source of the sublime is infinity, if it does not rather belong to the last. Infinity has a tendency to fill the mind with that sort of delightful horror which is the most genuine effect and truest test of the sublime. There are scarce any things which can become the object of our senses that are really and in their own nature infinite. But the eye not being able to perceive the bounds of many things, they seem to be infinite, and they produce the same effects as if they were really so. We are deceived in the like manner if the parts of some large object are so continued to any indefinite number, that the imagination meets no check which may hinder its extending them at pleasure. Whenever we repeat any idea frequently, the mind, by a sort of mechanism, repeats it long after the first cause has ceased to operate. Footnote. Part 4, Section 11. End footnote. After whirling about when we sit down, the objects about us still seem to whirl. After a long succession of noises, as the fall of waters, or the beating of forge hammers, the hammers beat and the waters roar in the imagination long after the first sounds have ceased to affect it; and they die away at last by gradations which are scarcely perceptible. If you hold up a straight pole with your eye to one end, it will seem extended to a length almost incredible. Footnote. Part 4, Section 13. End footnote. Place a number of uniform and equidistant marks on this pole, they will cause the same deception, and seem multiplied without end. The senses, strongly affected in some one manner, cannot quickly change their tenor, or adapt themselves to other things, but they continue in their old channel until the strength of the first mover decays. This is the reason of an appearance very frequent in madmen, that they remain whole days and nights, sometimes whole years, in the constant repetition of some remark, some complaint, or song, which having struck powerfully on their disordered imagination, in the beginning of their frenzy, every repetition reinforces it with new strength, and the hurry of their spirits, unrestrained by the curb of reason, continues it to the end of their lives. Section 9. Succession and uniformity. Succession and uniformity of parts are what constitute the artificial infinite. 1. Succession, which is requisite that the parts may be continued so long and in such a direction as by their frequent impulses on the sense to impress the imagination with an idea of their progress beyond their actual limits. 2. Uniformity, because, if the figures of the parts should be changed, the imagination at every change finds a check. You are presented at every alteration with the termination of one idea, and the beginning of another, by which means it becomes impossible to continue that uninterrupted progression, which alone can stamp on bounded objects the character of infinity. It is in this kind of artificial infinity, I believe, we ought to look for the cause why a rotund has such a noble effect. Footnote. Mr. Addison, in the Spectators, concerning the pleasures of the imagination, thinks it is because in the rotund at one glance you see half the building. This I do not imagine to be the real cause. End footnote. For in a rotund, whether it be a building or a plantation, you can nowhere fix the boundary; turn which way you will, the same object still seems to continue, and the imagination has no rest. But the parts must be uniform as well as circularly disposed, to give this figure its full force. because any difference, whether it be in the disposition or in the figure, or even in the color of the parts, is highly prejudicial to the idea of infinity, which every change must check and interrupt, and every alteration commencing a new series. On the same principles of succession and uniformity, the grand appearance of the ancient heathen temples, which were generally oblong forms, with a range of uniform pillars on every side, will be easily accounted for. From the same cause also may be derived the grand effect of the aisles in many of our own old cathedrals. The form of a cross used in some churches seems to me not so eligible as the parallelogram of the ancients. At least, I imagine it is not so proper for the outside. For, supposing the arms of the cross every way equal, if you stand in a direction parallel to any of the side walls or colonnades, instead of a deception that makes the building more extended than it is, you are cut off from a considerable part, 2/3, of its actual length; and, to prevent all possibility of progression, the arms of the cross taking a new direction, make a right angle with the beam, and thereby wholly turn the imagination from the repetition of the former idea. Or suppose the spectator placed where he may take a direct view of such a building, what will be the consequence? The necessary consequence will be, that a good part of the basis of each angle formed by the intersection of the arms of the cross must be inevitably lost. The whole must of course assume a broken, unconnected figure; the lights must be unequal, here strong and there weak, without that noble gradation which the perspective always effects on parts disposed uninterruptedly in a right line. Some or all of these objections will lie against every figure of a cross, in whatever view you take it. I exemplified them in the Greek cross, in which these faults appear the most strongly; but they appear in some degree in all sorts of crosses. Indeed, there is nothing more prejudicial to the grandeur of buildings than to abound in angles, a fault obvious in many, and owing to an inordinate thirst for variety, which, whenever it prevails, is sure to leave very little true taste. SECTION X. MAGNITUDE in Building. To the sublime in building, greatness of dimension seems requisite; for on a few parts, and those small, the imagination cannot rise to any idea of infinity. No greatness in the manner can effectually compensate for the want of proper dimensions. There is no danger of drawing men into extravagant designs by this rule; it carries its own caution along with it; because too great a length in buildings destroys the purpose of greatness, which it was intended to promote. The perspective will lessen it in height as it gains in length, and will bring it at last to a point, turning the whole figure into a sort of triangle, the poorest in its effect of almost any figure that can be presented to the eye. I have ever observed that colonnades and avenues of trees of moderate length were, without comparison, far grander than when they were suffered to run to immense distances. A true artist should put a generous deceit on the spectators, and effect the noblest designs by easy methods. Designs that are vast only by their dimensions are always the sign of a common and low imagination. No work of art can be great, but as it deceives; to be otherwise is the prerogative of nature only. A good eye will fix the medium betwixt an excessive length or height, for the same objection lies against both, and a short or broken quantity; and perhaps it might be ascertained to a tolerable degree of exactness, if it was my purpose to descend far into the particulars of any art. SECTION XI. INFINITY in pleasing objects. Infinity, though of another kind, causes much of our pleasure in agreeable as well as of our delight in sublime images. The spring is the pleasantest of the seasons, and the young of most animals, though far from being completely fashioned, afford a more agreeable sensation than the full grown, because the imagination is entertained with the promise of something more, and does not acquiesce in the present object of the sense. In unfinished sketches of drawing, I have often seen something which pleased me beyond the best finishing, and this I believe proceeds from the cause I have just now assigned. Section 12. Difficulty. Another source of greatness is difficulty. Footnote. Part 4, sections 4, 5, 6. End footnote. When any work seems to have required immense force and labor to effect it, the idea is grand. Stonehenge, neither for disposition nor ornament, has anything admirable. But those huge rude masses of stone, set on end, and piled each on other, turn the mind on the immense force necessary for such a work. Nay, the rudeness of the work increases this cause of grandeur, as it excludes the idea of art and contrivance, for dexterity produces another sort of effect, which is different enough from this. Section 13. Magnificence. Magnificence is likewise a source of the sublime. A great profusion of things, which are splendid or valuable in themselves, is magnificent. The starry heaven, though it occurs so very frequently to our view, never fails to excite an idea of grandeur. This cannot be owing to the stars themselves separately considered. The number is certainly the cause. The apparent disorder augments the grandeur, for the appearance of care is highly contrary to our ideas of magnificence. Besides, the stars lie in such apparent confusion as makes it impossible on ordinary occasions to reckon them. This gives them the advantage of a sort of infinity. In works of art, this kind of grandeur, which consists in multitude, is to be very cautiously admitted, because a profusion of excellent things is not to be attained, or with too much difficulty, and because in many cases this splendid confusion would destroy all use, which should be attended to in most of the works of art with the greatest care. Besides, it is to be considered that unless you can produce an appearance of infinity by your disorder, you will have disorder only without magnificence. There are, however, a sort of fireworks, and some other things, that in this way succeed well, and are truly grand. There are also many descriptions in the poets and orators, which owe their sublimity to a richness and profusion of images, in which the mind is so dazzled as to make it impossible to attend to that exact coherence and agreement of the allusions, which we should require on every other occasion. I do not now remember a more striking example of this than the description which is given of the king's army in the play of Henry the Fourth. All furnished, all in arms, all plumed like ostriches that with the wind, baited like eagles having lately bathed, as full of spirit us the month of May, and gorgeous as the sun in midsummer, wanton as youthful goats, wild as young bulls. I saw young Harry, with his beaver on, rise from the ground like feathered Mercury, and vaulted with such ease into his seat, as if an angel dropped down from the clouds, to turn and wind a fiery Pegasus. In that excellent book, so remarkable for the vivacity of its descriptions, as well as the solidity and penetration of its sentences, the wisdom of the son of Sirach, there is a noble panegyric on the high priest Simon the son of Onias, and it is a very fine example of the point before us. how he was honored in the midst of the people in his coming out of the sanctuary. He was as the morning star in the midst of a cloud, and as the moon at the full, as the sun shining upon the temple of the Most High, and as the rainbow giving light in the bright clouds, and as the flower of roses in the spring of the year, as lilies by the rivers of waters, and as the frankincense tree in summer, as fire and incense in the censer, and as a vessel of gold set with precious stones, as a fair olive tree budding forth fruit, and as a cypress which groweth up to the clouds. When he put on the robe of honor, and was clothed with the perfection of glory, when he went up to the holy altar, he made the garment of holiness honorable. He himself stood by the hearth of the altar, compassed with his brethren round about, as a young cedar in Libanus, and as palm trees compassed they him about. So were all the sons of Aaron in their glory, and the oblations of the Lord in their hands, etc. Section 14. Light. Having considered extension so far as it is capable of raising ideas of greatness, color comes next under consideration. All colors depend on light. Light therefore ought previously to be examined, and with it its opposite, darkness. With regard to light, to make it a cause capable of producing the sublime, it must be attended with some circumstances besides its bare faculty of showing other objects. Mere light is too common a thing to make a strong impression on the mind, and without a strong impression nothing can be sublime. But such a light as that of the sun immediately exerted on the eye, as it overpowers the sense, is a very great idea. Light of an inferior strength to this, if it moves with great celerity, has the same power; for lightning is certainly productive of grandeur, which it owes chiefly to the extreme velocity of its motion. A quick transition from light to darkness, or from darkness to light, has yet a greater effect. But darkness is more productive of sublime ideas than light. Our great poet was convinced of this; and indeed so full was he of this idea, so entirely possessed with the power of a well managed darkness, that in describing the appearance of the Deity, amidst the profusion of magnificent images, which the grandeur of his subject provokes him to pour out upon every side, he is far from forgetting the obscurity which surrounds the most incomprehensible of all beings, but with majesty of darkness round circles his throne. And what is no less remarkable, our author had the secret of preserving this idea, even when he seemed to depart the farthest from it, when he describes the light and glory which flows from the divine presence, a light which by its very excess is converted into a species of darkness. Dark with excessive light thy skirts appear. Here is an idea not only poetical in a high degree, but strictly and philosophically just. Extreme light, by overcoming the organs of sight, obliterates all objects, so as in its effect exactly to resemble darkness. After looking for some time at the sun, two black spots, the impression which it leaves, seem to dance before our eyes. Thus are two ideas as opposite as can be imagined, reconciled in the extremes of both, and both, in spite of their opposite nature, brought to concur in producing the sublime. And this is not the only instance wherein the opposite extremes operate equally in favor of the sublime, which in all things abhors mediocrity. Section 15. Light in building. As the management of light is a matter of importance in architecture, it is worth inquiring how far this remark is applicable to building. I think, then, that all edifices calculated to produce an idea of the sublime ought rather to be dark and gloomy, and this for two reasons. The first is, that darkness itself on other occasions is known by experience to have a greater effect on the passions than light. The second is, that to make an object very striking, we should make it as different as possible from the objects with which we have been immediately conversant. When therefore you enter a building, you cannot pass into greater light than you had in the open air. To go into one some few degrees less luminous can make only a trifling change; but to make the transition thoroughly striking, you ought to pass from the greatest light to as much darkness as is consistent with the uses of architecture. At night, the contrary rule will hold, but for the very same reason; and the more highly a room is then illuminated, the grander will the passion be. SECTION XVI. COLOR considered as productive of the sublime. Among colors, such as are soft or cheerful, except perhaps a strong red, which is cheerful, are unfit to produce grand images. An immense mountain covered with a shining green turf is nothing, in this respect, to one dark and gloomy. The cloudy sky is more grand than the blue, and night more sublime and solemn than day. Therefore in historical painting, a gay or gaudy drapery can never have a happy effect. And in buildings, when the highest degree of the sublime is intended, the materials and ornaments ought neither to be white, nor green, nor yellow, nor blue, nor of a pale red, nor violet, nor spotted, but of sad and fuscous colors, as black, or brown, or deep purple, and the like. Much of gilding, mosaics, painting, or statues contribute but little to the sublime. This rule need not be put in practice, except where a uniform degree of the most striking sublimity is to be produced, and that in every particular. For it ought to be observed that this melancholy kind of greatness, though it be certainly the highest, ought not to be studied in all sorts of edifices, where yet grandeur must be studied. In such cases the sublimity must be drawn from the other sources; with a strict caution, however, against anything light and riant, as nothing so effectually deadens the whole taste of the sublime. SECTION XVII. SOUND and LOUDNESS. The eye is not the only organ of sensation by which a sublime passion may be produced. Sounds have a great power in these as in most other passions. I do not mean words, because words do not affect simply by their sounds, but by means altogether different. Excessive loudness alone is sufficient to overpower the soul, to suspend its action, and to fill it with terror. The noise of vast cataracts, raging storms, thunder, or artillery, awakes a great and awful sensation in the mind, though we can observe no nicety or artifice in those sorts of music. The shouting of multitudes has a similar effect, and by the sole strength of the sound so amazes and confounds the imagination, that, in this staggering and hurry of the mind, the best established tempers can scarcely forbear being borne down, and joining in the common cry, and common resolution of the crowd. SECTION XVIII. SUDDENNESS. A sudden beginning or sudden cessation of sound of any considerable force has the same power. The attention is roused by this, and the faculties driven forward, as it were, on their guard. Whatever, either in sights or sounds, makes the transition from one extreme to the other easy, causes no terror, and consequently can be no cause of greatness. In everything sudden and unexpected we are apt to start; that is, we have a perception of danger, and our nature rouses us to guard against it. It may be observed that a single sound of some strength, though but of short duration, if repeated after intervals, has a grand effect. Few things are more awful than the striking of a great clock, when the silence of the night prevents the attention from being too much dissipated. The same may be said of a single stroke on a drum, repeated with pauses, and of the successive firing of cannon at a distance. All the effects mentioned in this section have causes very nearly alike. Section 19. Intermitting. A low, tremulous, intermitting sound, though it seems in some respects opposite to that just mentioned, is productive of the sublime. It is worth while to examine this a little. The fact itself must be determined by every man's own experience and reflection. I have already observed that night, Section 3, increases our terror, more perhaps than anything else. It is our nature, when we do not know what may happen to us, to fear the worst that can happen; and hence it is that uncertainty is so terrible, that we often seek to be rid of it at the hazard of a certain mischief. Now some low, confused, uncertain sounds leave us in the same fearful anxiety concerning their causes, that no light, or an uncertain light, does concerning the objects that surround us. Quale per incertum lunam sub luce maligna est iter in sylvis. A faint shadow of uncertain light, like as a lamp whose life doth fade away, or as the moon clothed with a cloudy night, doth show to him who walks in fear and great affright. Spenser. But light now appearing, and now leaving us, and so off and on, is even more terrible than total darkness; and a sort of uncertain sounds are, when the necessary dispositions concur, more alarming than a total silence. Section 20. The cries of animals. Such sounds as imitate the natural inarticulate voices of men, or any animals in pain or danger, are capable of conveying great ideas, unless it be the well-known voice of some creature, on which we are used to look with contempt. The angry tones of wild beasts are equally capable of causing a great and awful sensation. Hinc exaudiri gemitus iraque leonum, vincia recusantum, et sera sub nocte rudentum. Setigeraque sues, atque in praesibius ursi, severe et forme magnorum ululare luporum. It might seem that those modulations of sound carry some connection with the nature of the things they represent, and are not merely arbitrary; because the natural cries of all animals, even of those animals with whom we have not been acquainted, never fail to make themselves sufficiently understood. This cannot be said of language. The modifications of sound which may be productive of the sublime are almost infinite. Those I have mentioned are only a few instances to show on what principles they are all built. Section 21. Smell and taste, bitters and stenches. Smells and taste have some share too in ideas of greatness; but it is a small one, weak in its nature, and confined in its operations. I shall only observe that no smells or taste can produce a grand sensation, except excessive bitters and intolerable stenches. It is true that these affections of the smell and taste, when they are in their full force, and lean directly upon the sensory, are simply painful, and accompanied with no sort of delight. But when they are moderated, as in a description or narrative, they become sources of the sublime, as genuine as any other, and upon the very same principle of a moderated pain. A cup of bitterness, to drain the bitter cup of fortune, the bitter apples of Sodom. These are all ideas suitable to a sublime description. Nor is this passage of Virgil without sublimity, where the stench of the vapor in Albunia conspires so happily with the sacred horror and gloominess of that prophetic forest. At rex solicitus monstris oracula phoni, fatidici genitores addit lucosque sub alta, consulit Albunia nemorum quae maxima sacro fonte sonat, sevamque exaltat opaca mephitem. In the 6th book, and in a very sublime description, the poisonous exaltation of Acheron is not forgotten, nor does it at all disagree with the other images amongst which it is introduced. Spelunca alta fuit, vastoque immanis hiatu, scrupea tuta lacu nigro, nemorumque tenebris, quam super hod ulle poterant impune volantes, tendere iter penis, talis sesse halitus atres, focibus effundens supera ad convexa ferabat. I have added these examples because some friends, for whose judgment I have great deference, were of opinion that if the sentiment stood nakedly by itself, it would be subject at first view to burlesque and ridicule. But this, I imagine, would principally arise from considering the bitterness and stench in company with mean and contemptible ideas, with which it must be owned they are often united. Such a union degrades the sublime in all other instances as well as in those. But it is one of the tests by which the sublimity of an image is to be tried, not whether it becomes mean when associated with mean ideas, but whether, when united with images of an allowed grandeur, the whole composition is supported with dignity. Things which are terrible are always great. But when things possess disagreeable qualities, or such as have indeed some degree of danger, but of a danger easily overcome, they are merely odious as toads and spiders. Section 22. Feeling, pain. Of feeling little more can be said than that the idea of bodily pain, in all the modes and degrees of labor, pain, anguish, torment, is productive of the sublime, and nothing else in this sense can produce it. I need not give here any fresh instances, as those given in the former sections abundantly illustrate a remark that, in reality, wants only an attention to nature, to be made by everybody. Having thus run through the causes of the sublime with reference to all the senses, my first observation, section 7, will be found very nearly true, that the sublime is an idea belonging to self-preservation, that it is therefore one of the most affecting we have, that its strongest emotion is an emotion of distress, and that no pleasure, vide Part 1, Section 6, from a positive cause belongs to it. Numberless examples besides those mentioned might be brought in support of these truths, and many perhaps useful consequences drawn from them. Sed fugit inter rea, fugit irrevocable tempus, singula dum capti circumvectamur amore. End of Part 2, Sections 6 through 22 of A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, by Edmund Burke.